Most of the people who will watch this video all the way through are already exhausted, but they still don't know what's wearing them out. It isn't the job, it isn't the routine. It's something older and quieter than that. It's the fatigue of living a life that was never actually chosen. How much of what you have was really decided by you? How many of your commitments truly matter? How many of your goals are your own, and how many were planted inside you without permission? Back in 1845, Henry David Thoreau faced these very same questions. He walked away from the life he knew, went to live for 2 years in a cabin by the edge of a lake in Massachusetts, and arrived at a conclusion that still unsettles anyone who gets close to it. Most people, he wrote, move through life in quiet desperation, chained to obligations they never picked for themselves. And the line he left behind, about a man being rich in proportion to the number of things he can afford to let go of, wasn't written to be hung up as wall decor. Maybe you've never stopped to think about this, but the single most decisive question of adult life is also the one most often ignored. How much is enough for you? Not for your neighbor, not for the algorithm, not for the influencer who pops up on the screen while you eat lunch. For you, that question carries the weight of a gate. Behind it lies the rest of your life, organized or not, headed towards something you chose or didn't. And almost no one pushes that gate open. There's a reason for that. Defining what's enough is uncomfortable because it forces you to admit that maybe you never really knew where you were headed, that you ran hard without knowing what prize you were running for, that you gave up mornings and conversations, postponed reading and stolen rest, in the name of a goal you never fully spelled out. There's a specific kind of emptiness that opens up when someone realizes this for the first time. It isn't sadness, it's clarity. And clarity, at first, hurts. That's why the question keeps getting dodged. Not out of intellectual laziness, out of self-protection. The problem is that this protection comes at a price that's far too high. Without defining what's enough, any amount turns into permanent insufficiency. You can double your salary, move to a different city, and the feeling comes back untouched, because it was never about the number. It was about the absence of an inner standard. Picture a middle-aged executive who spent 30 years chasing a title, and who wakes up the morning after the promotion feeling exactly the same as he did before. Or someone who saved for years to buy an apartment, and 3 months later is already eyeing the next floor up, the next neighborhood, the next view. That phenomenon isn't a moral weakness. It's the mathematical result of trying to solve from the outside what can only be solved from the inside. You aren't lost because something's missing. You're lost because you never stop to define the destination. And nothing the world hands you as a map works when the destination is left blank. The symptom is a productive life that looks successful on the surface, with an exhausted interior and no direction of its own. The dodged question stays there waiting, patient, in some corner of your awareness. Sooner or later, it'll have to be answered. Usually, when it shows up at specific moments. On a Wednesday with nothing special going on. On the way home, when the traffic comes to a halt. In the middle of a sleepless night. On an empty holiday when nobody's asking anything of you. It shows up in those in-between moments because that's exactly when the mind, with no task in front of it, manages to hear itself. And almost no one can sit with that moment. Almost everyone reaches, in the very next second, for any stimulus that will silence the question again. But anyone who agrees to stay with it for a few minutes finds out something important. The question doesn't hurt as much as the years of running from it have already hurt. It only feels frightening while it's being put off. When somebody hears the phrase simple life, the mind jumps straight to images that have almost nothing to do with anyone. A shaven-headed monk in absolute silence. An isolated cabin somewhere in a forest in Northern Europe. A man who gave up everything and sleeps on a mattress on the floor of a white, empty apartment. Those images aren't a simple life. They're renunciation turned into a pose. And they push away, almost surgically, the very people who would most benefit from hearing about simplicity. Because no one wants to give up their own life in the name of some unfamiliar aesthetic. The confusion is cultural, manufactured, repeated without end. Simplicity became a synonym for deprivation, for giving things up, for living with less in order to look more virtuous. That's interior design magazine minimalism, not philosophy. There's an entire industry today selling emptiness as a product. White apartments with 3 objects photographed from above. Closets holding 7 identical pieces in shades of beige. Productivity manuals teaching you to abandon your stuff like you're ticking boxes on a list. That kind of simplicity is just another form of consumption, now sold under a different label. Real simplicity has nothing to do with the head count of objects in your closet. It has to do with the clarity behind how you chose them. One person can live in a house full of books, inherited furniture, photos on the walls, and souvenirs from trips, and live simply. Another person can live in a house that's nearly empty, sterilized for the camera, and live in the most complete inner chaos. What matters isn't in the walls. It's in whoever decides what comes in and what goes out. When that distinction goes unseen, simplicity turns into yet another form of comparison. Whoever has less beats, whoever has more. Whoever renounces seems deeper than whoever enjoys. That's just the same game reorganized, with new rules and the same psychological prizes. Simplicity wasn't designed to give you one more ranking to compete in. It was designed to pull you out of the rankings altogether. Anyone who gets that stops measuring others by the count of things they own or don't own, and starts measuring every person, including themselves, by the consistency between what they say they want and what they actually choose. That's the real metric, and it doesn't make for a good photograph. Picture 2 people. The first one travels a few times a year, checks out new cafes, buys books she loves, swaps her headphones once the current pair stops cutting it. The second one doesn't travel, doesn't go out, barely buys anything. Which of them is living a simpler life? The intuitive answer is wrong. It isn't in what each of them does, it's in the why. There's an ancient principle that almost seems custom-built for the 21st century, one that shows up in 1,000 different forms throughout philosophical writings since antiquity. The wise person doesn't despise possessions, he owns them without being owned by them. Wealth should serve, never rule. That little shift changes everything. The problem was never having. The problem is being had. It's being carried by things instead of carrying them. It's letting objects, bills, trips, and schedules dictate the rhythm of your mind. When that happens, even the most well-stocked person lives in scarcity. And when that shift is made, even a life full of things can feel light. Because it's organized around a person, not around an aesthetic. There's also another old version of this same argument. It isn't the man who has little, but the one who wants more, who is poor. Poverty isn't a condition of the wallet, it's a condition of the mind. You can be a billionaire and a beggar at the same time. You can have little and live with the sovereignty of someone who lacks nothing. The simple life doesn't refuse pleasure, it refuses autopilot mode. It isn't a monastic sentence, it's a pact with your own consciousness. You can buy the ticket to Tokyo, you can trade in your car, you can eat out a few times a week. As long as each of those choices was made by you, not made inside you by some ad that slipped through your eyes without asking permission. That's the real gate of simplicity, not what comes into your house, what comes into your decision. When that authorship returns to a person's own hands, any choice turns light, including choices that look extravagant from the outside. And any choice without that authorship turns heavy, including choices that look modest from the outside. The lightness isn't in the weight of the object, it's in who's carrying it and why. There's an invisible line dividing 2 people who buy the exact same object. One buys because she understands it serves her. She knows the use, she's measured the desire, and she knows she isn't filling some hole the bag doesn't actually need to fill. The other one buys because the day was rough, because somebody posted something, because her brain needs a little reward to make it through the week, because boredom is hitting her like a wave in the middle of the afternoon. Both walk out of the store with the same shopping bag. Both head home with identical objects, but only one of them brought herself home. The other brought back a small betrayal. Simplicity is intentionality. It's the act of pausing even for 2 seconds before the decision. It's looking at your own impulse and asking whether it came from inside or whether it landed there, planted by someone who profits when you buy. Without that pause, any attempt at living simply turns into performance. The person empties out her closet, posts the photo, feels a passing relief, and 3 months later, the closet is full again, because the closet was never the problem. The problem was the automatic link between desire and action. There's a way of existing built around accumulating, and there's a way of existing built around being present. People who live in the first mode try to solve the inner emptiness by buying another layer of cover for that emptiness. It works for a few minutes. Then the emptiness comes back, now a little deeper, because it just earned proof that it can't be solved from the outside. Anyone who doesn't interrupt that loop, even with very few possessions, stays a hostage. Because the problem isn't in consumption itself, it's in who's pressing the button. When you start putting that pause in, something small and strange begins to happen. You start noticing how often you almost acted on autopilot, how many times your hand reached for the shopping cart before your mind had decided anything, how many times the app opened itself while you were waiting for the elevator. And right there sits a detail that changes how you see your house, your schedule, your closet, your whole week. We'll come back to it in a few minutes because it needs a little more ground beneath it before it can land with the weight it deserves. Cast your mind back to last week. Count how many times you said yes to things you didn't actually want deep down. The happy hour invite with people who drain you. The Sunday morning commitment that ate up the one piece of time that was really yours. The meeting that could have been an email and dragged on for an hour and a half. The texting conversation that went on for 2 hours and gave you nothing. The extra spend on an app you almost never open. Each of those yeses seemed small in the moment. Each one came packaged with a reasonable justification. It's no big deal, just this once. They'll be upset if I don't show. But all of them have an invisible, cumulative effect. Every unintentional yes is a slice of energy and attention that leaves your domain. And the sum of those yeses is the explanation for that feeling of getting to Sunday night with no idea where the week went. You didn't even live badly. You just didn't live what you would have chosen to live if you'd actually been choosing. There's an old observation that seems to cut straight through this scene. All of humanity's unhappiness comes from a single thing, which is not knowing how to sit quietly in a room. That idea is more than 300 years old. It explains the automatic yeses. The person accepts the invite, schedules the appointment, takes the call, because silence in the room feels more uncomfortable than presence out on the street. The yes isn't generosity, it's escape. And that escape eats up a life in small pieces, without ever showing itself for what it really is. Modern life has been set up in a way that seems to reward whoever is available. Anyone who says yes to everything gets praised as flexible, generous, always present. But there's an enormous difference between being present for what matters and being available for anything that asks for your attention. The second posture silently drains the time out of an adult life. And by the time someone catches on, 10, 15, maybe 20 years have usually passed. Learning how to say no is, in practice, learning how to say yes to what actually matters. And few acts have such an immediate effect on a person's sense of peace. But there's a psychological reason behind that difficulty that we'll pull apart later, because it connects directly to the next point and to the inner state that drives a person to fill every gap with more noise. Open the drawer, that drawer, you know which one. Inside it sits a small cemetery of decisions. The charging cable that was never used. The kitchen gadget that promised to transform your meals and got used exactly once. The book you swore you'd read this year and you're still stuck on page 20. The phone stand bought on a midnight impulse. The red headphones that seemed like a good idea until they arrived and didn't match anything. Each of those objects cost a piece of your worked-for time. And each of them sits there as proof, in solid material form, that most of what felt like a necessity was just noise organized into product form. Those objects aren't insignificant. They are silent monuments. Tiny statues of decisions made in low consciousness states. And they teach you something if you pay attention. They don't speak badly about you. They speak about a whole system designed to catch you exactly in the moments when you aren't looking. The tired late afternoon, when all you want is to numb the fatigue with a small dopamine hit. The bored Sunday, when the brain begs for any novelty to fill the void, The work week has been keeping postponed. The anxious night before sleep, when the mind looks for a distraction so it doesn't have to face whatever it'll think about once the light is off. The screen scrolling while the mind is wide open like a gate without a latch. Those moments aren't random. They've been mapped out by teams of engineers and psychologists who make a living turning the urge to buy into something easier than the urge to pause. The design of the screen, the sound of the notification, the color of the checkout button, all of it is calibrated for a single goal, which is to convert attention into a transaction. The problem isn't the object. The problem is the mental state that drew it in. When the mental state changes, the drawer starts emptying itself. Not because you threw things out, because new things stopped arriving. And little by little, with no heroic effort, the house starts feeling more like yours, as if the noise had turned itself down without you touching a single dial. That natural emptying out is maybe the most reliable sign that something has shifted on the inside. The hands stop reaching, even when the screen comes up. And right then, the person realizes she always had more control than she thought. It had just been outsourced. And there's an even quieter effect of that disconnection, one that shows up without warning a few weeks in, and that will unfold further down the line. When the hand stops reaching for the screen, the brain discovers, with some surprise, that it had been doing that the whole time just to avoid feeling what was there on the other side, waiting. It isn't anything catastrophic. Usually, it's just a little boredom, a little restlessness, a vague feeling that life could be something else. But that's exactly the feeling that had been muted by years of non-stop scrolling. When it shows up, with no distraction to silence it, it starts to speak. And what it usually says are the directions the person had been ignoring in order to keep going the way she was. That initial discomfort is one of the first signs of coming back to yourself. It might sound harsh, but it needs to be said. That chronic feeling of insufficiency that runs through the contemporary world isn't your personal failure. It's the predictable effect of an environment. You wake up and the first image to enter your head is the edited life of people you don't even know. Before coffee, before you've had a thought, before you've existed as a person, you've already seen 3 houses that aren't yours, 2 bodies that aren't yours, 1 trip that wasn't yours. The human brain didn't evolve for this. It was shaped in groups of 40 or 50 people, within a horizon of comparison the mind could actually process. Today, the horizon is infinite. Comparison has become water you're born inside without realizing you're wet. That noise occupies the space where your own thinking used to live. Where there used to be leisure, there's scrolling. Where there used to be boredom, there's distraction. Where there used to be silence, there's a podcast playing at 1.5 times speed. And that silence was exactly what allowed a person to hear herself. Without it, any inner question gets muffled before it can break the surface. Seneca was already saying in an essay called On the Shortness of Life, written around the year 49 of the Christian era, that it isn't that our life is short, it's that we waste so much of it. The busiest men, he said, are the most miserable because they live for everyone except themselves. The fuller the schedule, the more absent its owner. He wrote this for a Rome with no phones, no internet, no infinite feed. Imagine the weight that sentence carries now, when the schedule doesn't even fit into 24 hours, and the app still pings you about what got left out. The fuller the exterior, the more distant the interior. And that drifting away from yourself is the real engine behind the feeling of never being enough. You don't feel insufficient because something's missing. You feel insufficient because you stopped listening to yourself, and anyone who stops listening to herself starts hearing only other people's voices. That's the true root of modern malaise. It isn't a material problem, it's an acoustic one. Your own inner voice has been muffled by decades of imported noise. Hearing it again requires, before any technique whatsoever, just the rare gesture of turning the volume down. And turning the volume down, in today's context, is an act of courage, because silence hands the person back every question she'd been successfully postponing. The questions about a job that maybe was never actually chosen, about relationships that maybe became habits, about projects that maybe were quietly drifting out of reach while the schedule kept filling up. There's a minimal tool, almost laughably simple, that changes the way an adult life runs when applied with patience. Before saying yes to an invite, before closing a purchase, before kicking off a project, before continuing a relationship that drains you, a person can stop and ask herself two questions. Does this actually serve me? Does this bring me closer to who I want to be? It isn't a rigid rule. It isn't a system. It doesn't need a spreadsheet, doesn't need an app, doesn't need any self-help book. It's an exercise in awareness that fits into 4 seconds. Applied over a few weeks, it starts to operate without effort, like a lens adjusting itself to the eye. The answers will surprise you. Plenty of things that seemed essential won't pass the test. Plenty of relationships that felt mandatory will start sounding like soulless habits. Plenty of habits will reveal themselves as anesthetics dressed up as routines. And the opposite happens too. Small things that seem dispensable reveal themselves as pillars. The morning walk, the phone call with the person who matters, the book on the nightstand that's been put off, the silent conversation with yourself at the end of the day. There's a simple truth behind those two questions. There's a small space between what the world pushes at you and what you respond with. That space is small, but an entire adult life fits inside it. People who don't enter that space live as reflexes. People who do enter it start living as authors. Those two questions work even on people who've never read a single line of philosophy. And there's a psychological reason for that, which we'll unpack shortly. But before that, it's worth noting that this philosophy that sounds like theory only starts to carry real weight when it becomes practice. More than 2,000 years ago, in a garden in Athens, Epicurus was teaching a division of human desires that seems custom-built for the era of one-tap shopping. There are natural and necessary desires: food, shelter, sleep, affectionate bonds. Without those, the body slides into real suffering. There are desires that are natural but not necessary. Tastier food, a more comfortable home, a pleasant trip. They don't harm you when reached for in moderation, and they don't destroy you when they're absent. And then there are desires he called empty and hollow. Fame, unlimited recognition, accumulation that has nowhere to land, the approval of strangers who barely know you, status as an end in itself. Those desires have a feature that makes them especially dangerous. They have no endpoint. You never finish any of them. To accumulate more, to be more recognized, to be admired by an even bigger crowd of people you'll never actually meet. The scale is infinite because the desire is abstract. And when a desire is abstract, any amount you reach feels small. In the Principal Doctrines, a short collection of statements Epicurus left behind, there's a sentence that might be the cleanest summary of this whole philosophy. The wealth of nature is defined and easy to obtain, but the wealth of empty opinions falls into an infinite abyss. The philosophers of the garden lived with little. Bread and water, a bit of cheese, some good conversation with friends in the late afternoon. And they described that life as more cheerful than the life of any debt-ridden merchant in Athens. Not because they renounced pleasure, quite the opposite. They understood pleasure better. They knew it has a natural ceiling, and that everything above that ceiling is just pain disguised as a quest. Epicurus realized, without needing neuroscience, that most human suffering comes from that third category. The first two get resolved by practical living. The third only gets resolved when the person understands that she herself is the source of the fire, not the fuel. Recognizing an empty desire when it shows up is the beginning of freedom. It isn't about killing it by force. It's about looking at it and calmly asking whether it came to you or whether you went to it. The answer is almost always the second one, and almost always looking at that head-on is enough for the desire to lose half its size. That simple act of identification, repeated over months, recalibrates the whole internal system of desire. The person doesn't turn into a saint, she turns lucid. And lucidity, in this context, is the beginning of any lasting peace. A historical note on Epicurus is worth making here, because his image has been distorted over the centuries. Today, his name became an adjective associated with luxury, with culinary refinement, with a life of expensive pleasures. Nothing could be further from the actual philosopher. He lived in a modest property on the outskirts of Athens, simply called the garden, where he welcomed women, freed slaves, and students from all kinds of backgrounds, something scandalous by the standards of the time. The menu was simple. In one of the surviving letters, Epicurus asks a friend to send him a small pot of cheese so that, whenever he liked, he could throw himself a feast. A small pot of cheese. For a man who understood more about pleasure than almost any other thinker of antiquity, that detail is the entire pedagogy of Epicureanism in a single scene. Real pleasure, stable pleasure, pleasure that doesn't generate pain afterward, comes from the full appreciation of small available things, not from the endless chase of rare and expensive ones. Anyone who understands that undoes, in a single moment, centuries of marketing aimed in the opposite direction. There's a type of luxury that no amount of money can buy, and precisely because of that, it's been almost erased from the contemporary imagination. It's the luxury of space, not the space inside the house, the space inside the day, the gap between one action and the next, the breath between one thought and the next, the minute when no one calls you, no one tags you, no one summons you. That space was colonized at some point in the last 2 decades, and most people didn't even notice the moment it left. It slipped out through the cracks in the apps, through the ease of filling every pause with a scroll, through the silent culture that teaches you idle time is wasted time, and the result is a life full of events, but empty of presence. You've been in the places, but you weren't really there. You've cleared the schedule, but you didn't live the day. Old traditions had a special name for this quality of time, and it was a central value of cultured life. It was the kind of active rest, fertile free time, the space where thought could unfold without interruption. Without that time, there was no philosophy, no art, no depth. Today, that time has practically disappeared from everyday experience. Idleness has become suspect. The pause has become waste. Silence has become anxiety. When the space comes back, and it comes back when the excess goes out, something shifts in the quality of experience. Breakfast starts to have flavor. The commute to work starts to have scenery. The conversation with the person you love starts to have a face. Small, ordinary events, formerly crushed by autopilot mode, regain their outlines. That return isn't magical, it's mechanical. When the mind stops being filled by external stimuli, it starts noticing what's happening at the lowest level of reality. And it's at that level, not at the level of big events, that most of a life is actually lived. You don't live on vacation, you live on Tuesday nights. And it's precisely on Tuesday nights that space, or the absence of it, decides whether you're alive or just functioning. Recovering that space is maybe the most radical act a contemporary person can pull off, because it's the act most explicitly fought against by the digital architecture of everyday life. And for exactly that reason, it's the act that gives back, in very little time, a feeling that seemed lost forever. We're living through the first era in which comparison isn't an event, it's a state. Before digital exposure, a person compared her life to her neighbors, her co-workers, the relative who showed up at Sunday lunch. It was a small group, comparable, with context. Today, a person compares her life to the edited version of the entire planet's existence. She compares her apartment to homes in Aspen. She compares her body to photos retouched in a studio. She compares her trip to sponsored itineraries. She compares her marriage to 40-second video clips. That kind of comparison isn't just unfair. It's mathematically designed for you to lose every time. Because there will always be someone with more. Somewhere in the world. Somewhere in the feed. At least on the surface. The chronic dissatisfaction of people who, objectively, live better than any previous generation comes from that source. It isn't gratitude that's missing, it's context. Without context, any life looks poor, because it's being measured against an impossible collage of every high point from every life. Nobody actually lives the life that shows up on the phone, but everyone measures themselves against it. There's a well-established observation about envy. It isn't satisfied by comparison to the whole, but by comparison to whoever's just one step above you. The person doesn't envy the unreachable billionaire. She envies the acquaintance who has just a little more than she does. And since today's technology opens real-time windows into thousands of those edited acquaintances, envy has become a non-stop routine. And here, a particularly cruel detail shows up. The human brain doesn't clearly distinguish what it sees often from what is real. The more a person sees other people's edited lives, the more those lives become her internal reference. And the real life she actually lives starts to look poor by contrast. It's a silent hijacking of her own standard of comparison, and it's the most constant fuel for contemporary dissatisfaction. Anyone who understands this gains one of the most underrated tools of modern adult life: the option to close the window, not as an angry gesture, as a peaceful choice. Every window closed is a slice of your own mind that comes back home. And anyone who starts closing those windows regularly notices, after a short while, that she had more available energy than she imagined. That diffuse weekend fatigue, that tiredness that didn't come from the body or the job, was simply the cumulative effect of hundreds of silent comparisons processed throughout the day without conscious permission. Cutting off that source is like shutting off a faucet that had been dripping for months in the apartment without anyone hearing it. Suddenly, in the silence that follows, the house feels bigger. And there's a layer to this comparison mechanism that few people see, one that will show up with even more force further along. The person thinks that if she gets the thing she envies, the envy stops. It doesn't stop. That might be the worst-kept secret of this whole race. When you reach the point that seemed to be the destination, the point moves. The new car becomes the old one. The new house becomes too small. The salary that seemed impossible becomes normal. The body you worked for becomes the starting line for an even more demanding version. That phenomenon has a technical name in psychology, but what matters here is the lived effect. The person never arrives. Doesn't matter how much she earns. Doesn't matter how much she accumulates. The horizon recedes at the same speed as she advances. Even people throughout history who had it all left records, in private journals, that this wasn't enough if the mind stayed hostage. Emperors wrote, in private journals, that we lose the time of living by worrying about the opinions of others, without realizing that this time is finite. If even people who had everything needed to remind themselves of this every day, anyone needs to. The comparison race was designed never to end. There's no victory inside it. Whoever tries to win loses on principle, because every victory reactivates the game. The only way not to lose is not to play. And stepping out of that game isn't a renunciation. It's a quiet promotion to a life in which you are the judge of your own sufficiency. That's the kind of freedom no one celebrates publicly, because it doesn't make a good photo, but it's maybe the only real freedom left for the contemporary person. And anyone who tastes that freedom once, even for a week, rarely wants to go back to the previous race. Because what you discover from the outside is that the exhaustion of that race had become so constant, it had turned invisible. And without it, life has a quality that seemed lost since childhood. There is no expert in the world who knows your life better than you do. There is no therapist, mentor, philosopher, book, or influencer with access to your midnight fears. No one but you knows which conversations still haven't been had, which letters still haven't been written, which plans keep getting put off for reasons you've never said out loud. Counselors can guide, books can provoke, mentors can show shortcuts that saved years for whoever already walked the path. But none of them lives your life. None of them pays your bills. None of them sleeps in your bedroom. None of them stares at the ceiling at 3:30 in the morning with that specific question you don't tell anyone about. There's a kind of wisdom no book delivers, because it only develops through conscious, repeated experience in each person's own concrete life. It's the practical wisdom that builds up over time, decision after decision, in situations no manual could predict. That maturing is what's at stake when a person starts to reclaim authority over her own life. Reclaiming that authority isn't arrogance, it's maturity. And it's, at heart, a relief. Because from the moment a person understands that she's the only final authority over her own life, she stops waiting. She stops looking for the formula. She stops waiting for somebody from outside to deliver the key that's been in her pocket all along. That moment is usually a quiet one. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes as an almost imperceptible turn on an ordinary day when the person looks at her own day and realizes that it is, finally, hers. It could be a Wednesday afternoon, on the way back from the grocery store with a heavy bag in hand. It could be at an airport window, waiting for a delayed flight. It could be lying down before sleep, after closing some book or other. What matters is that that moment, whatever the hour or the setting, marks an invisible line. Before it, the person was looking for outside authorization to start living. After it, she knows the authorization was always hers. That kind of turn doesn't come with a speech. It doesn't come with a manifesto. It doesn't require breaking with anyone. It comes as a quiet adjustment of inner posture, which other people will only notice months later, without being able to say exactly what changed. The person seems firmer, more centered, less available to spend energy where it yields nothing. Decisions come out faster, the no's weigh less, the yeses matter more. And there's a sentence by Henry David Thoreau, written almost 2 centuries ago, that's maybe the most precise definition of what we're calling sufficiency here. It shows up a few paragraphs down. There is no universal formula for sufficiency. That's important, and it's rarely said clearly. What's enough for one person can be scarcity for another, luxury for a third, and none of that is a problem. The mistake is trying to fit everyone into the same number, the same routine, the same aesthetic, the same pattern of consumption. Sufficiency is inner work, slow, personal, non-transferable. It requires sitting with yourself in some kind of silence and asking questions that seem naive but aren't. What do I, honestly, like to do, without performance, without expecting approval, without needing to seem interesting to anyone? Which people in my life give energy back instead of draining it? In which moments of my own history did I feel most whole? And what did those moments have in common? Which places, physical or mental, make me breathe differently? Which parts of my routine, if they vanished tomorrow, wouldn't be missed? Which parts, if they vanished tomorrow, would change the texture of the whole day? Those answers don't come ready-made. They come in pieces, over weeks, sometimes over months, but they come. And when they start coming, sufficiency stops being an abstract concept and becomes a map, a simple map, with only a few points marked, but one that actually leads somewhere. Most adults live without that map. They live on someone else's directions, on imported goals, on borrowed success. They work for the title someone else thought they should want. They live in the city someone else decided was the right one. They buy the size of house someone else decided was the reasonable size. The result is that even when they arrive, they don't recognize the destination because it was never theirs. Defining your own sufficiency is the most subversive act a person can pull off inside a culture that makes money off your permanent dissatisfaction. And it's also the most serene act. It isn't anger at the world. It's putting each thing back where it actually fits. The things that serve, stay. The things that don't, go. And without any announcement, without a public manifesto, without a single shout, life begins to coincide with the person living it. It's worth describing, calmly, what changes in the day of someone who starts to operate this way. The morning gets its weight back. It used to be a hallway to rush through on the way to work. Now it has coffee, a shower, an open window. The job goes on, but it doesn't invade the gaps. There's a real lunch break, not a break interrupted by 5 notifications that replace chewing with scrolling. There's a night when the body actually slows down, instead of just trading the light of the computer screen for the light of a smaller screen. Conversations with the people close to you regain your full attention. The person realizes she was hearing half of what they were saying, and now she's hearing the whole sentence. Sleep gets better without her changing her mattress. Anxiety drops without her changing neighborhoods. Everyday decisions get lighter because the number of options got naturally reduced by the filter of those 2 questions that came up earlier. It isn't a miracle. It's just the effect of taking off the extra clothing after a hot day. You aren't losing anything. You're putting down what was never yours to begin with. And that realization, once it starts to settle in, has a specific effect. The person stops looking for the next thing that's going to solve everything, because she realizes the problem was never the lack of the next thing. It was the surplus of the previous one. There's a new kind of silence in this phase. It isn't the silence of absence. It's the silence of fullness. It's the kind of silence you hear at the end of a good conversation, or in the second, right after the last chord of a song that matters. That silence starts being felt as a presence, not as a void. Before, it used to scare her, because she had gotten used to running from it with any stimulus available. Now it calms her, because it's become company. And in that company, small things regain their outlines. The sound of coffee being brewed, the noise of traffic in the background, the afternoon light moving slowly across the wall. Details that had always been there, but were invisible under the thick layer of constant distraction. The simple life isn't an aesthetic slowdown for posting a photo. It's a real slowdown, so you can stop living with your back turned to yourself. And it can happen in a big city, in a rented apartment, at an ordinary job, with an ordinary family. It doesn't require a cabin, doesn't require a forest, doesn't require anything beyond an inner turn. The scale of the revolution is domestic, and precisely because of that, it's possible for almost anyone, anywhere on the map, at any phase of life. There's no permission to ask for. There's no required launchpad. There's only the small, repeated gesture, day after day, of continuing to choose from the inside out. And there's a specific texture to that kind of day that's worth describing. The hands feel less heavy. The breath drops a little deeper. The gaze stops searching for the next thing all the time and starts landing on the thing happening right now. The cut between your fingers in the late afternoon. The face of the person talking with you in the kitchen. The sound of the key turning in the lock when you get home at night without rushing to open your phone. Those moments seem irrelevant in the grand order of life, but they are in fact its substance. Most of an adult life is going to happen in moments exactly that size. Not in the extraordinary events, on Tuesday nights, on Thursdays on the way to work, on Saturday mornings before any agenda has started. Simplicity was never about renunciation. That's maybe the point that needs to be said most clearly, because it's the one that pushes away the most people who could benefit from it. It isn't giving up everything in order to look pure. It's letting go of what doesn't serve you so you can lift up what does. It's redirection, not amputation. The man mentioned at the start of the video who ended up in a cabin by the edge of a lake in the middle of the 19th century, left, in Walden, the book he wrote after the experience, the key to understanding this distinction. He said he went to the woods because he wanted to live deliberately, to face only the essential facts of life, and see if he couldn't learn what it had to teach instead of discovering, when it came time to die, that he hadn't lived. The word deliberately is the key to his whole argument, and to this one. Not living by habit, not living by imitation, not living by accident. Living by choice, act by act, decision by decision. And the line he coined to close that argument, which was previewed at the start of this video, deserves to be read now in the exact form in which it was written. A man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone. Wealth there isn't what gets accumulated, it's what isn't needed. Wealth is the size of the free inner space. The fewer the ties, the fewer the automatic commitments, the fewer the possessions ruling the schedule, the more that person has of herself for herself. And that's what you actually gain, in concrete terms, when somebody walks this path. You gain time and presence. You gain focus and rest. You gain the clarity and the intention that are missing in most adult lives of this era. You don't gain a little. You gain precisely what's missing in the ordinary day, the ordinary week, the ordinary year of the contemporary adult. And you gain it in a way no one can take away from you afterward. Because it isn't tied to external factors. It's tied to an inner posture. That's what differentiates what we're calling sufficiency here from any lifestyle trend. Trends pass. Inner postures, once adopted, tend to stay. And anyone who adopts that posture gains an additional benefit few describe. She stops fearing material losses the way she used to fear them. Not because she became indifferent, because she understood that the essential part of her life was never in what could be lost. The car can get stolen, the house can be vacated, the job can end, and the inner center of gravity remains. That shift of center is maybe the only form of lasting peace an adult life can have in any era, and especially in this one, where external instability has become the standard backdrop of existence. Anyone who anchored that center inside herself can move through any turbulence, whereas anyone who left that center in the hands of external factors lives on permanent alert, even when things, on the outside, look fine. Here's the turn that gives the whole philosophy of this video its name. Most of the adult population spends their lives trying to answer the wrong question. What more do I need? That question never has an answer. It was designed never to. Every answer that seems to close it opens 3 more right after. It's an equation deliberately left open, kept open by the environment we live in, because an unanswered question keeps consumption moving and attention scrolling. When the person realizes this, she can swap the question. And that swap is the main event that can happen in her adult life. What do I honestly want? That second question has an answer. It has a concrete, simple, attainable, discoverable answer. Almost always, that answer is more understated than the world's advertising led you to believe. It usually involves real people, not people on screens. It usually involves time, not extra money. It usually involves presence, not filmed presence. It usually involves peace, not validation. Picture a 50-year-old adult who, after 2 decades chasing promotions, discovers that what he actually wanted was to leave work in time to have dinner with his kids. Think too of somebody who saved for years for a bigger house and found out, after the move, that she missed the small kitchen where she learned to make coffee. Real life is full of moments where the right question, asked early, would have saved years of detour. And here's the detail that makes this liberating. Almost always, that answer is already, in some form, within reach of the person asking. It doesn't demand a radical move to a different city. It doesn't demand a new job. It doesn't demand the whole next decade. It only demands recognition. The life you want, deep down, is usually a clear, attentive version of the life you already have, not a totally different life. And that realization takes off the person the enormous weight of believing she has to start everything over, to start well. She doesn't. She just has to start looking with different eyes. The revolution isn't geographic. It's perceptual. And perceptual is exactly the kind of revolution that fits into any ordinary day, into any ordinary body, into any ordinary life. I know it's hard to hear this, but maybe this is the only thing that actually needs to stay with you once the video ends and you close the tab. You don't need to move cities. You don't need to quit your job. You don't need to sell everything. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to wait for the next phase, the next raise, the next relationship, the next birthday, the next January. Everything you need for the first step is already here. In this body, in this moment, in this life you have, with all the imperfections it carries. Sufficiency isn't a faraway place. It's an inner posture that can start operating today, in small, invisible acts. Refusing a yes that was about to slip out unthought. Pausing 2 seconds before the next impulse purchase. Looking at a person you love and actually hearing what they're really saying. Closing the feed 10 minutes earlier than you'd planned. Taking the first half hour of the morning back from the phone's control. Sitting down for coffee without a second screen open. Each of those micro acts is a silent vote for the life you say you want. They seem too small to change anything, but the size of an adult life is determined by repeated micro acts, not by big epic decisions. Big decisions are just the cumulative effect of 1,000 silent choices nobody saw. Nobody posts the moment she decided not to buy. Nobody live streams the moment she said no to an invite. Nobody applauds the Sunday afternoon when she chose not to fill the boredom with more stimulus. And it's exactly in those unfilmed moments that life starts to coincide with the one living it. Maybe that's the only sustainable form of change there is. Not the radical turn announced on social media, not the complete reset in a single weekend, but the small patience of someone who decides every day to make choices that are a little more coherent than the ones she made the day before. Those small adjustments, repeated over months, add up to more than any loud revolution. An adult life doesn't change from the outside in, it changes from the inside out. And it changes slowly, with steps forward and steps back, with weeks when everything seems to settle, and weeks when the old autopilot returns. Those oscillations are part of the process, not flaws in it. Anyone who understands this gains patience with herself, and that patience is maybe the last ingredient that was missing for sufficiency to stop being a pretty concept and start being, in fact, a way of existing. This video ends here. The rest gets discovered as you walk. If anything in what was said reached you, even lightly, mark this moment. Like this video, drop in the comments the question that stayed in your head, and subscribe to the channel to keep this conversation going in other videos. See you next time.